Mark Twain and the Perfect Ignoramus. For the sake of time, I will not be reading the introduction, the first paragraph, and the concluding paragraph. The novel begins with a preface that Mark Twain includes either to tell you how to read the novel or to warn you not to look for something that he has said is not going to be answered. His open warning to the reader should guide our reading towards one of fictionalized history. The ungentle laws and customs touched upon in this tale are historical, and the episodes which are used to illustrate them are also historical. End quote. Twain, however, also warns that, quote, one is quite justified in inferring that wherever one of these laws or customs was lacking in that remote time, its place was competently filled by a worse one. End quote. This statement is an obvious jab at both medieval Arthurian society and the 19th century American society, which saw that many of the laws that just abolished slavery in America were replaced with laws that were just as bad to the freed slaves. After the preface, and even before the story really begins, there are three changes of narrations that take place in the word of explanation. It begins with Twain walking with a stranger who, quote, attracted me by three things: his candid simplicity, his marvelous familiarity with ancient armor, and the restfulness of his company. End quote. Through a museum of medieval history, just as a guide shows them the armor of Sir Sagramore with a strange bullet hole. When Twain notices the stranger's smile, quote, not a modern smile, but one that must have gone out of general use many, many centuries ago, and muttered, apparently to himself, which you will, I saw it done. He then hears the man pause, add, I did it myself. End quote. Thereafter, the narration changes from Twain to Sir Thomas Malory's story, how Sir Lancelot slew two giants and made a castle free. Then the narration returns back to Twain as the stranger comes and tells his story, with the narration shifting over to the stranger. Without a further explanation from Twain about the stranger, the reader is pulled into the stranger's story with a double nature, who speaks as one who is archaic and yet 19th century modern, who knows of history and was a part of it, who was a stranger of the 19th century as well as of the 6th. This man, Hank Morgan, is the protagonist in Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, a character who wants to introduce 19th century technologies into 6th century Camelot once he is transported there. The reader finds out how Hank is transported to Camelot in the first place, when he was hit over the head with a pipe by an employee named Hercules. Hank arrived in Camelot confused, but he is drawn to the page Clarence, who tells him where he is, what year it is, and also explains as various people tell their stories during the first banquet. Quote, my master and thine? That is the good knight and great lord Sir Kay the Seneschal, foster brother to our liege the king. End quote. Once Hank realizes that he cannot get home, he decides that he is going to survive by creating and holding power through 19th century technology. For example, Hank successfully uses his future knowledge to escape death by using the information he was given from Clarence to establish the timeline, and gains a position of power in King Arthur's court as a magician and knight. After establishing and gaining authoritative power, Hank then introduces more 19th century technology into 6th century Camelot, including telegraph lines, guns, and electric fences. While there are critics of the novel who focus on the negative effect of Hank's technologies in Camelot, there are a few who focus on the good of the technologies. Jennifer Liberman takes on the most positive approach to Hank's introduction of technologies to Camelot. Liberman does comment, however, that Hank only allows a select few to handle the technology that Hank invents, or rather recreates in Camelot. Notably, Hank first begins to make technological advances only because he misses the little inconveniences, or as he looks around the barren court, quote, it made me homesick to look around this proud and gaudy but heartless bareness at our house in East Hartford, end quote. So rather than using technology to advance Camelot for the sake of the society, Hank recreates technology which he knows will bring him comfort from Connecticut. This gives a hint of the selfishness in Hank's technological introductions. Hank also brags about his work. Quote, I was training a crowd of ignorant folk into experts in every sort of handiwork and scientific calling. End quote. When Hank first goes on his quest with Sandy, we learn of several schools and industries that Hank desires for Camelot. Quote, I detailed an intelligent priest from my Department of Public Morals and Agriculture. I should have gotten the people long enough to start the newspaper. End quote. By wanting to educate the lower class of Camelot, whether for selfish reasons or not, Hank does bring them an ability to write, which very few people were actually able to do when Hank first got to Camelot, and gives a lot more power to the society. After leaving Camelot with Sandy, and becomes more and more annoyed at the ridiculousness of the armor and its lack of pockets, Hank and Sandy come upon a group of freemen, causing Hank to observe, quote, by a sarcasm of law and phrase, they were freemen, end quote. Hank's sarcasm in this law is justifiable. Connecticut Yankee was written during the time of American Western expansion. It was a time when former slaves were released to gain their own land, but with the new name freemen. Former slaves or freemen, and the group Hank and Sandy come upon, were only by name. The freemen of America and Camelot were allowed to travel and become workers for the land, but if they settled on the land, they would have to pay back the government, or in Camelot the lords, in order to gain the land. When Hank and Sandy are among the group of freemen, Hank suggests breakfast. He is both touched and hurt by the group's reaction of astonishment that a noble would suggest to eat with them. Hank is distressed by Sandy's reaction towards the group. Quote, my lady put up her scornful lip and withdrew to one side. She said in their hearing that she would as soon think of eating with the other cattle. End quote. Equality then becomes a very important goal for Hank as he realizes that the lower class in Camelot is treated no better than they are in America. There are several problems in Camelot that Hank believes that he alone can fix. Hank goes on a quest with Sandy, where they meet several characters and make stops along the way. Hank also has a problem with the adventure of knight errantry. For those knights he does not like, and he wants the practice to be disbanded. Hank also meets Morgan Le Fay, whom Hank considers eccentric but also silver-tongued, a trait which Hank considers to be dangerous. We know from Mallory that Morgan Le Fay is the mortal enemy of Arthur. But in Twain's novel, Morgan Le Fay is just a ruler following her own laws that she has established. When they meet each other for the first time, both are equally afraid of each other. Hank was afraid of her dungeons, and Morgan Le Fay is afraid of the boss and the reputation Hank had already established. To cover her fear, Morgan Le Fay tells Hank, quote, La, but do list to thine handmaid, as if one gifted with powers like to mine might say the thing which I have said unto one who has vanquished Merlin. End quote. When Hank eventually travels around Morgan Le Fay's dungeons, his fear of her is confirmed when he finds a recently married couple who has been separated from each other for 9 years, so long that they no longer ask if their spouse is alive. What was their crime? The wife had offended the lord of her land because he was denied sexual relations with her on her own wedding night. Her husband's crime was coming to fight for her honor. For the readers and Hank, this is obviously not a crime, but in Camelot, it is a horrendous offense. Yet Hank's American mind said everyone deserves to be proven guilty before being condemned. Mark Twain had written The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn before writing Connecticut Yankee. In fact, Twain was already writing a sequel for Huck, Jim, and Tom before he wrote about Hank. However, as the dime novels gained more and more backlash for being gruesome stories of violence towards women, gambling, and crimes against a civilized society, Twain decided that instead of looking forward to show the violence from the present society, he should show the violence of the past. However, unlike Huck, whose mind changes over the time he spends with Jim, Hank brings with him to Camelot the knowledge that people should be treated equally because they are also humans. From Twain's preface, we know that Twain is not trying to answer if the divine right of kings is an actual thing. There is the idea of earning one's title versus gaining a title. Hank does believe that all the nobility of Camelot is lazy and should not have their titles because they did not earn the title of lord or lady. Rather, that the title was handed down to them by birth. He resents his presumed inferiority. Quote, I was not even respected. I had no pedigree, no inherited title. So in the king's and the nobles' minds, I was mere dirt. End quote. That is why the title given to him, the boss, is so special to him. He earned it by blowing Merlin's tower and taking away the power of an evil, manipulative, and vindictive man. He earned it from the lower class citizens, which the nobility thinks that's where Hank is from, and where he should always remain. In this way, Hank is a good example of the American dream, that anyone would be able to pull themselves up from their bootstraps and make a name for themselves. However, Hank is also being hypocritical in suggesting that he has always earned his position, and title. Hank was the manager of a great arms factory, and he learned to make everything. Guns, revolvers, cannons, boilers, engines, all sorts of labor-saving machinery. End quote. Hank did earn his title of manager, but he also had the advantage of having a father who gave him the skills necessary to build those machines. More troubling is that Hank does not credit his learned skills for bringing Camelot up to a Yankee standard. Instead, he lies and says that he is a magician who can destroy Camelot with a mere blink of an eye. Does one have to lie in order to give the people and earn justice? A very important question that should be asked. Why Twain makes Hank, a rather rude, pompous Yankee, go to Camelot? Hank is neither good nor is he bad, and so he is more like a modern tragic hero. With this double nature, we can also assume that the novel has a double nature as well. While not the first book to explore time travel, it does use this concept in correlation with the trope of man who has lost his way home and must go through trials and tribulations in order to return home. In many of the stories, the main character is neither a hero but not a villain either. The trope of a man returning home has been made for many centuries, including the epics of ancient Greece. For example, Odysseus, a war hero who longs to return home to his wife and child. Yet, despite wanting to return home, still delays his journey by angering a powerful god, seduces and gets seduced by a witch, and once he returns home, kills all 12 suitors. Hank, in a similar way, does the same actions in which he creates his own obstacles in return home. Twain was inspired to write Connecticut Yankee after he wanted to steer away from just writing another dime novel. He was introduced to Sir Thomas Malory's La Mort d'Arthur. After reading Malory's work, Twain was inspired to try and provide an answer to medieval romance. Our first reading of Connecticut Yankee makes it seem like many other medieval stories, such as Dante's Inferno and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Throughout the novel, there are direct quotes and stories from Malory that Sandy tells Hank during their quest. There are also several more references to both Dante and Chaucer. There is an entire chapter as a direct reference to Chaucer's Pilgrims, when Sandy and Hank come upon a different group. Quote, this company of pilgrims resembled Chaucer's in this, that it had in a sample of about all the upper occupations and professions the country could show, and a corresponding variety of costume. End quote. After, Sandy explains that, quote, they journeyed to the Valley of Holiness, for to be blessed of the godly hermits, and drink of the miraculous waters, and be cleansed of sin. End quote. This should be considered a direct parallel to both Dante and other several Bible stories. The next quest that Hank goes on is with King Arthur, as they go in disguise into Camelot to travel around and show Arthur what is going on in his kingdom. While traveling, Hank has to teach the king how to act as a peasant. Quote, I came to a resolution. The king must be drilled. Things could not go on so. He must be taken in hand and deliberately and consistently drilled. End quote. This should be considered funny, because Hank himself had to be drilled in order to help himself gain power in Arthur's court. Yet, it would seem that Arthur adapts to his role of a peasant more quickly and more kindly than Hank adapts to being in a royal court. In chapter 29, The Smallpox Hut, is when we see King Arthur as the hero for the lower class. Quote, he was great now, subliminally great. The rude statues of his ancestors in his palace should have an addition. I would see to that. And it would not be a mailed king killing a giant or a dragon, like the rest. It would be a king in commoner's garb, bearing death in his arms, that a peasant mother might look upon her child and be comforted. End quote. This scene establishes Arthur as a ruler, hero, and protector for both the nobility and the peasants. After this, Hank knows that his loyalty must lie with Arthur, and so he becomes more protective of the king. Later on, Hank is confronted with a situation where he could have chosen not to go back and save the king from being hanged, but Hank does, because he must save the actual hero of Camelot. The next problem that Hank wants to get rid of is knight-errantry. But specifically, he wants to end knight-errantry for Merlin and his knights. There are two scenes in which Hank kills off several knights to bring the death of a knight-errantry into reality. The first is when he finally competes in a tournament that he was challenged to from earlier in the novel. Hank was challenged by Sir Sagramore, who failed in his quest to find the Holy Grail, but had Merlin help him to try and defeat Hank. Quote, a duel between two mighty magicians. A duel not of muscle, but of mind, not of human skill, but of superhuman art and craft. A final struggle for supremacy between the two master enchanters of the age. End quote. Hank and Merlin, who have been going back and forth as who the true magician of Camelot. We know that Hank is aware of the fact that he is just using his historical knowledge of the past and uses it to mislead the society of Camelot. Merlin does a similar sideline to manipulate the court, but he does it to suppress the society. Regardless, Hank shows in the tournament that while he is in Camelot, he is a practical Yankee. Quote, I was in the simplest and comfortablest of gymnast costumes. Flesh-colored tights from neck to heel, with blue silk puffings about my loins, and bareheaded. End quote. While a funny image, it also shows that while Hank does accept some customs of the Arthurian lifestyle, he does not lose the practicality of Connecticut ways, which dictates that he wears something that gives him more freedom than armor. After successfully defeating Merlin's knights in the tournament and killing several other knights, Hank ends Merlin's position in court forever. Now comes the darkest moment in the whole of the novel, in which the tragic hero becomes more tragic. The last couple of chapters are about a war that leads to the downfall of Hank. The reader finds out that Hank and Sandy get married, and they have a child called Hello Central. Quote, I didn't laugh. I am always thankful for that. But the strain ruptured every cartilage in me, and for weeks afterwards, I could hear my bones clack when I walked. End quote. Yet, this is one of the last times that both Hank and the audience laugh at Sandy's misunderstandings of Hank's 19th century expressions. The story then goes to darkness and despair. Several critics note that Hank is ultimately defeated by his own technology. Kenneth Anderson suggests that there was a danger of Hank's technology and that the technology is evil and that it eventually turns on its own human creators. The biggest scene in which Hank's technology truly turns against him is in the final battle scene, when Hank and the young boys of Camelot end up trapped in Merlin's cave, a scene revealing both the destruction of Hank's technology and Camelot's society. The battle scene is horrific, and Hank also agrees that his actions are wrong. What many critics seem to gloss over the fact is that Hank is in the middle of a war, and in war one must be killed or be killed. Hank does not gloat over the fact that he is killing a soldier after soldier through his own electrical fence. Clarence comes to tell Hank that war has broken out, and the knights whom Hank trusted, including King Arthur, were dead, and the evil powers of the church were coming for Hank and his young soldiers. Then Hank turns his own machines into weapons of war. In the last chapter written by Hank, he is trapped in Merlin's cave. The reader discovers that Hank's army consists of 52 young boys, and that his machines must be destroyed. As he finds that this war is doomed for both armies, he wants to send a truce to the church. But Clarence laughed the sarcastic laugh he was born with, and said, "Somehow it seems impossible for you to ever fully realize what these nobilities are. Now let us save a little time and trouble. Consider me the commander of the knights yonder." Clarence claims the truce would end in disaster. Clarence becomes a second version of Hank, but with more sarcasm and even more desire for power. Afterwards, Hank and Clarence go as a reception committee to see the electric fence in action. "Yes, it was a man, a dim, great figure in armor, standing erect with both hands on the upper wire. And of course there was the smelling of burning flesh. Poor fellow, dead as a doornail, and never knew what hurt him. As the bodies of the knights begin to pile up, killed by a dead man, you see. Killed by a friend, in fact." Hank sees the body count continue to grow, thanks to Hank's machines. This sight leads to Hank's final observation, "But how treacherous is fortune in a little while, say an hour, happened to a thing, by my own fault, but I have no heart to write that. Let the record end here." This brings an end to Hank's own tragic story.